Everybody. My name is Paul Gorski. I'm the founder of EdChange and the Equity Literacy Institute. And today I want to talk a little bit about some of the common pitfalls of equity work. These are things that I've observed in schools and school districts, even colleges and universities that I've worked with really all over the world. Practices that they adopt, strategies and frameworks that they adopt, approaches that they adopt that actually might be doing more harm than good, even if they're done in the name of educational equity or multicultural education or intercultural education or social justice education or my favorite, inclusive excellence. I have no idea what inclusive excellence means. It's like somebody took the two vaguest terms in the education lexicon and just squished them together so that none of us will have any idea what they're talking about. But people use that term too. So whatever you call it, these are some of the pitfalls that I think we can all work to try to avoid in order to have more meaningful and transformational equity practice within our institutions. So the first pitfall I want to talk about is what I call universal validation. So universal validation is the idea that because we're talking about diversity or because we're talking about multiculturalism or whatever it is we're talking about, that everybody's opinion is valid and everybody's experience and everyone's ideas are equally valid, and we just have to appreciate one another's ideas. Unfortunately, when it comes to equity, that doesn't work because not all ideas and perspectives, first of all, they're not all accurate. Second of all, they're not all equitable, right? So I don't think it's a very good idea to have, we want to talk about racism and how to address racism in our schools, to invite some white supremacists so that we can incorporate their ideas and values and perspectives into the conversation. What we want is people who have different perspectives on how to eliminate racism, people who come from different models or philosophies about the best way to recognize and eliminate racism. But certainly what we don't want is to validate somebody's racist perspective. We don't want to validate, and especially think about this from an institutional perspective. I understand at the individual level in terms of doing outreach with people and trying to pull people into a movement for educational equity that we might show some understanding about perspectives and ways people have been socialized. I'm not talking about that specifically. I'm talking about what we embrace as an institution in terms of what is going to move us forward toward equity. So for instance, somebody who says, well, I believe that homosexuality is a sin, and so I'm not going to buy into that, and this is what my religion taught me about that. Perhaps I could say, okay, I understand that's how you were socialized as an individual. But if we're trying to move an institution forward, then we can't buy into that as part of our philosophy as the institution. The educational institution is we need to create an equitable and just environment for everyone in this institution. So you might come in with that heterosexist or homophobic attitude, but that is not going to be validated in terms of what we are doing as an institution. It is not about universal validation. It is about identifying and buying into the equity view and rewarding buying into an equity view and embracing that as an institution. So it's not about accepting everyone's different values and attitudes. It's about embracing and cultivating attitudes that are in line with equity. The second pitfall I want to talk about is trying to address equity problems with cultural solutions. Equity problems with cultural solutions. I think part of the problem is we have to recognize inequity or injustice these are really sort of moral and ethical problems as much as anything else. They are ideological problems. We cannot solve class inequity by celebrating diversity. We cannot address what is like a moral institutional shortcoming with solutions that don't address the underlying moral ideological problem attached to them. So that means that it's okay to do celebrating diversity, but we have to recognize that celebrating diversity really doesn't have anything to do with equity. You can celebrate diversity every day of the school year, every week of the school year, every hour of the school day. That is not going to make your institution less racist, less sexist, less Islamophobic. It's not going to make your institution less ableist or less xenophobic. The only thing that's going to address those issues is equity responses. So one way that I think about it, just in terms of assessing my own work around equity, I think of it as, there is no path to equity that does not involve a direct confrontation with inequity. So often a school will call me and say, someone from a school will call me and say, we have this big racial achievement gap in our school, and we see that our students of color are being kicked out of class more than white students and those sorts of things. And we really would like some help on this. And I'll say, okay, I'm happy to help. But then they'll say something like, but we're not really ready to talk about racism. We don't think we're ready to really use that language. So if you can come in and talk about this and not really have to address racism. But I say, I can't do that because those problems are racism. So there's no way to address those problems without addressing them as racism, without directly confronting them as problems of racism and naming them as problems of racism. We could think also today about, there's this constant stream through history of what I call equity detours. There are all these frameworks that people grab a hold of because they look like they have something to do with equity, when really they're detours around equity. They're not direct confrontations with inequity. So right now, especially in the United States, what's really important are things like grit. So instead of addressing class inequities or socioeconomic inequities in schools, the idea is what we need to do is help low-income kids become more gritty and more resilient so that they can overcome the inequities and recognize what's happening there. The idea there is to help them overcome inequities they should never be experiencing to begin with. So that's a detour around a direct confrontation with equity. Growth mindset is another thing that's becoming popular. It's sort of the same thing. Another example of that is learning styles. So there was a big chunk of time there in the mid 1990s to maybe mid 2000s, where a lot of the conversation around diversity in schools was built around this idea of learning styles. So this group has a learning style, and that group has a learning style. And if we just learn those learning styles, then we can help those groups do better. Of course, this is a completely nonsensical idea to think that all I have to know is that somebody's ancestors at some point in history came from somewhere in Asia and I can know what their learning style is. I mean, that's a ridiculous notion to begin with. But the other thing is, when researchers actually started looking into learning styles, what they found was that it's kind of made up. It's sort of a myth, this idea that individuals have learning styles, and if we could just teach to those learning styles, they'll learn better. There's no research that supports that notion. So in essence, what happened for about 10 or 12 years is a lot of the conversation around equity and diversity was based on this thing that didn't even exist. And schools and districts put all kinds of resources and training into this framework that didn't even exist. Why did they do that? Because it was an easy framework. It's much easier to talk about, well, here is the Latino learning style, and here is the poor people learning style, and here, and that sort of thing. It's easier to do that than saying, we need to eliminate racism from our schools. We need to eliminate economic injustice from our schools. So we have to make sure that we aren't sort of slipping into those detours. And again, I think the best way to measure that in terms of our individual practice and institutional practice is just to remember there is no path toward equity that does not involve a direct confrontation with inequity. So you can go to your school, go to your institution, and look at the equity initiatives and ask yourself, are these initiatives naming, identifying equity even in its most insidious, subtle form, and then confronting that inequity? Are we directly confronting ways that harmful nationalism seeps into educational policy, or heterosexism, or xenophobia, or any of these sorts of things? Are we naming that and addressing it directly? Are we looking at bias and prejudice and inequity and injustice that's actually built into educational policy at the classroom, school, district, bigger national policy level? Are we looking at that? Or are we looking for any kind of strategy that can help us avoid those conversations? I find that that is so often what happens in these conversations about educational equity and justice. There's no way to get to equity that way. The only way to get to equity is to name and address directly the inequity and the injustice. So that is a pitfall that we also have to avoid. A third pitfall that I often see is a lack of real leadership when it comes to equity. A lack of leadership that has the will to stand up to inequity. Part of the challenge is, one thing that we know is that when an institution, let me take a step back. In essence, equity work in schools and school systems is about looking at how access and opportunity are not fairly distributed, are not equitably distributed. And that can come in a lot of different forms. That could be in terms of material resources, right? Who has access to technology? It could be experiential. Who has access to tutors? Who has access to the best pedagogies? Who has access to the best trained teachers? Who has access to a full range of curriculum and those sorts of things? It could be about that. It could be about who has access to a learning environment in which the curriculum reflects them. They see reflections of themselves in the curriculum. Part of it could be about who has access to a learning environment where they're not bullied, where they don't experience inequity. Who has access to that? Any school that I've been in around this world, that access is not fairly distributed. It's not equally or equitably distributed. So equity work is about looking at how it's distributed and then redistributing the access and the opportunity to be more fair, to be more just, doing whatever we have to do to redistribute it, whether that's from professional development to changing policy and everything. So the lack of leadership that I find often is based on the fact that when we start redistributing access and opportunity, the people in the communities who have developed a sense of entitlement to have more access and opportunity than other people will often start complaining about that, right? And how often I've seen leaders, school leaders, either positional or non-positional leaders, sort of backtrack on their commitment based on just a little bit of resistance is confounding to me. And I'll give you an example of this. I was talking with some middle school students at a school in the United States. And they told me this story about how they went to their principal. They said, we want to start a gay-straight alliance. So we want to start basically a student organization that will include gay, lesbian identifying students, bisexual identifying students, queer identifying students, and allies to those students, to create sort of a safe space where we can come together and talk about our experiences and our challenges, and maybe do some programming to help the school move forward around this. So they went to the principal. They said, we want to start a gay-straight alliance. The principal said, great, go start your gay-straight alliance. So the students did this. They went and started the gay-straight alliance. And about a week later, the principal came back and said, well, we're going to change this gay-straight alliance to a diversity club because we're a little worried that a gay-straight alliance is too exclusive. So it might alienate some families. I worked with the students to kind of dig into what actually happened there. And what we found out was that a couple of parents, in fact, a total of 2 parents, had called that principal and complained that they don't want a gay straight alliance in the school that their kids attend. They're offended by it. So basically, what the principal did was decided to cater to these homophobic parents instead of addressing the problem that he had these kids in school who didn't experience the school as an equitable place. And he went, so because 2 parents complained, that's all it took for that principal to roll back the commitment and go to the kids and say, we're not, instead of a gay straight alliance, we're going to have this other thing. So that's an example of a lack of will on the part of leadership. Another thing I often see in terms of leadership is passing the responsibility down. Sometimes it's to like a committee, often a committee like a diversity committee in the school that really has no power other than maybe writing a diversity statement. Sometimes the power is even passed down to a student club, which should never happen. Student clubs are not responsible for creating equity and justice in the school. The school leadership is responsible for that, right? So the people with the most, what I call the most equity literacy, the most literacy around equity in the school, have to be the people with the most power in the school, including the positional leaders. So positional leaders, principals, assistant principals, superintendents have to be the people who are the most vocal about supporting equity, the most vocal about supporting the teachers and counselors and school psychologists and other people who are the biggest supporters of equity. Leadership cannot pass that off to somebody else. And that's often a pitfall that I see. Leadership passing that to people who have less power than leadership has. And then it just sort of dissipates or disappears. The next pitfall that I want to talk about is that so often I find in schools that the progress, the sort of path toward equity, the movement toward equity, the initiatives for equity are paced, are sort of designed to go at the pace of the most resistant people. Right, so we do professional development, and the idea is, well, we don't want to offend anybody, and we have these people who are uncomfortable, and so we're so careful about stepping forward very carefully. Let's not offend anybody. The problem is what we're doing there is we're choosing our pace. We're prioritizing the comfort of the people who are the most resistant to talking about issues like xenophobia and racism and Islamophobia and sexism and heterosexism and racism, that we're choosing our pace, prioritizing their comfort. We don't want to make them too uncomfortable. Instead of prioritizing addressing the discomfort or the inequity that the most marginalized people in the institution experience. So what we really need to do is prioritize the most marginalized people and their interest. Equity work ought to be driven by the interests and concerns and needs as identified by the most vulnerable, the most marginalized people in our institution, not by the most resistant people. So again, a call on school leaders and school district or region leaders. If you are having a hard time with this, and if this is not your area of expertise, then you need to surround yourself with people who have the expertise so that they can move at a pace, they can move you forward, and they can move the institution forward. Instead of, often what I see is every year we have the Diversity 101 workshop. So every year we're catering to the people who are the most resistant, who are the most uncomfortable, instead of we also have all these people in our schools who are ready to move forward and to create change. And very rarely in schools do I see an opportunity for them to be challenged, for them to keep moving forward and to provide leadership forward for the school. Lastly, I want to talk about a pitfall that I call doing what's popular instead of doing what's effective. And we can again go back to that learning styles example. But when we're choosing our equity initiatives, are we doing it based on frameworks that we know work? Are we doing it based on strategies that we know actually create more equity instead of strategies that avoid equity or detour around equity? So learning styles is a great example of that. First of all, like I said, we know that learning styles is kind of a myth. But also learning styles really doesn't have anything to do with equity, right? Because there's really no such thing as learning styles that align to particular identity groups. So we especially should be careful about that. Another example of this is something like cultural competence. A lot of the research on cultural competence programs in schools shows that when those things are chosen, they're usually chosen specifically because they detour around real conversations about racism. There was a study that where researchers looked at a bunch of medical education programs that used cultural competence training as like their central diversity or equity component. And what they found was none of the cultural competence programs even mentioned issues of inequity and injustice. These were done in the US. And imagine having all these cultural competence programs as the primary diversity or equity component of an educational program and not even mentioning racism. And that's what these researchers found. So we have to be careful not to grab onto something like that without looking into, is there actual evidence that this works? Is there actual evidence that this is going to get us closer to equity? Instead, a lot of times what I find are schools grab onto frameworks, a lot of times frameworks that were debunked a long time ago. And again, I think learning styles is a good example of that. Another example is the culture of poverty framework, which is really popular around the world for schools talking about class and poverty issues. Instead of talking about the challenges and barriers that students experiencing poverty face, the focus is on how do we understand the mindsets or the cultures of students experiencing poverty so we can fix their mindsets or their cultures. Instead of addressing the barriers and the inequities they face. That culture of poverty or mindset of poverty framework was questioned and eventually completely debunked in the 1960s by social scientists. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that still the dominant way that we talk about class and poverty issues in school if it was debunked in the early 1960s. So again, are we grabbing onto it because it's popular? Are we doing it because this school over here did it, so we should probably do it? Are we doing it because someone wrote a book about it? Are we doing it because there's actual evidence that it can get us closer to equity? Lastly, the last pitfall that I want to discuss relates to what I just talked about with the culture of poverty framework. And it is embracing a deficit ideology instead of a structural ideology. And it's basically what I just said. If your equity initiatives are about fixing marginalized people, if your equity initiatives are about fixing people who experience racism, fixing people who experience homophobia, fixing people who experience poverty, instead of addressing the conditions that create the racism and the xenophobia and the homophobia and heterosexism and the sexism and all of the ableism and all those sorts of things. If your equity initiatives are about fixing marginalized people rather than about addressing the conditions that marginalize people, there's no way to get to equity from that. The cultures or mindsets of people experiencing poverty, again, first, those don't even exist. But the cultures and mindsets of people experiencing poverty are not the problem. That is not why educational outcome disparities exist. Educational outcome disparities exist because of the inequities and the barriers and the challenges that people experiencing poverty face. So if we want to create better educational outcomes or address bigger conditions, we need to address the challenges of barriers. Sometimes those challenges and barriers exist inside school, right? The bullying, the policy, the inequities, the ways that parents who are experiencing poverty often are condescended to when they are communicating with school staff. We need to address those things. We need to address access to living wage work, access to preventive health care, and access to safe and affordable and stable housing. And then also all the ways that inequities play out in schools. So this is sort of another measuring stick that you can use for your equity initiatives. Again, are these initiatives about fixing marginalized people, or are they about fixing or eliminating the conditions that marginalize people? If we want to get closer to equity, we need the latter instead of the former. So those are our pitfalls and hopefully ways we can reframe how we're thinking about equity in order to avoid those pitfalls and embrace strategies that have a much better chance of getting us a little closer to equity. Again, my name is Paul Gorski. I'm the founder of EdChange, which you can find at EdChange, that's edchange.org, as well as the Equity Literacy Institute. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.